Guys, this is Matthew from Real Estate Deal Junkie, and I want to go over some of the mistakes, or more specifically, the 5 mistakes that you should avoid when house hacking a apartment complex. House hacking is all the rage, and yes, it's a great way to get started in real estate, save you a whole bunch of money on your living expenses. But the reality is, there's a lot of mistakes that are, not as common in other types of investing that you might not even notice or think about. So this is actually my first house hack. It was a 3 unit in Dayton, Ohio. I purchased it for 115,000 right here. I bought it for 115,000 December 2021. And then I actually sold it not that long after purchasing it in 2023. So it's a 3 unit. I think you'd have a better image on Google. So it's a beautiful 3-story building. You have a unit on each story, so it's a 3 unit building. You have a unit here, a unit here, a unit here, and parking in the back. Overall, the numbers worked out really great for me. I was able to live in one of the units and essentially live rent free. I was actually cash flowing $200 a month while living rent free. So the numbers on this were incredible. Back in 2021, things were a little bit cheaper. This same building right now might be worth like 200 grand, but the numbers still work. Even if you did buy this thing for 200 grand and you lived in one, the numbers can still work out. But here's the first mistake. The first mistake I made was when I bought the building, I essentially told the tenants that I was the owner. I didn't even think of why that would be a bad idea, but I essentially told the tenants, hey, my name is Matthew, I'm the owner. I live, I think I lived on that first floor there. Yeah, I lived on that first floor because that one was vacant when I bought it. These two had tenants. So I told them that I was the owner, and that was probably the biggest mistake I could have done. Why? Because when they know you're the owner, they understand and they know that you have the capability to let things slide. For example, someone's late on rent and go like, "Hey man, I'll have the rent on the 15th." And it's like, "No man, like you can't just pay the rent late. My mortgage company's never going to say, "Hey, I can't call my mortgage company and say I'm going to pay them late and they'll just let it slide." No, they're going to apply late fees. And if I take too long, then they're going to start the eviction process or the foreclosure process. So just the way the bank treats me, it's not impersonal. This is what you agreed to and this is what you have to do or you need to leave. It's the same idea, but it's a lot harder when they know you're the owner because then they're always looking for exceptions. So what I do is I realize this down the road as I house hack in the future is that I need to tell tenants that I am the property manager. I am the on-site property manager. So then I can blame it on the imaginary owner, and then there's no animosity within the building. For example, in that same situation, tenant comes up to me, hey, I can't pay rent till the 15th. And I say, hey, I don't think that's going to be a problem, but any payments that come in after the 7th, the owner expects us to apply a late payment. So if you're going to pay by the 15th, as long as you don't wait till the 20th, because that's when we start eviction process. That's when the landlord expects me to file for evictions. But as long as you pay by the 15th with the late fee, it shouldn't be a problem. You see how that conversation went so much different? That exact same conversation when I'm the landlord is like, come on, man, it's just this one time. It's never going to happen again. If they know I'm the owner, I can't say, hey, that's just landlord expects me to follow the rules, and these are the rules they set out for me. So it's not under my control. So I've done that with all my buildings after that. Anytime I live in an apartment building, and I've lived in 10 units that I've owned, I've lived in 6 units that I've owned. At any point after that, I tell them I'm the property manager. So yes, I'm here to enforce the rules. I'm here to collect rent. I'm here to put up notices and things like that for tenants. But I'm not the buck doesn't stop with me, even though it does. But I don't let them know that. So that's the number one mistake. Never tell your tenants you are the owner. Tell them you are the property manager, which isn't a lie. You are the property manager and the owner, but always introduce yourself as the property manager. Okay. Number two is this is a huge one. Okay. Never mix your personal finances with the property's finances. And I know that sounds like common sense, but when it's a house hack, it's a lot easier for everything to get commingled together because your utilities are the property's utilities, your rent or your mortgage gets taken out of your personal, and it just kind of gets really messy. So always create a separate bank account for the property, even if you are house hacking the property. And from that separate bank account, the mortgage should come out of, the utilities should come out of, and everything should come out of that separate account. This number one is good so you can keep good records, okay, where you can create a system where you're keeping the records, you know what's coming in, and you can create a real idea on what the building is making, which is going to be the next one. But just make sure that you're separating the property's funds. It seems so easy just to set up the auto pay for the utilities and for the mortgage and all that from your personal bank account, but it is a mistake. You'll regret it when it comes to tax time and you have to file the taxes, and it's super messy. And even if you do get audited, it could get it could be a liability issue with you not being able to prove what's expenses for the property and what's personal expenses. That brings me to the next one, though, is that you want to make sure that you are calculating the profitability of the house hack correctly. Okay. So many people are saying, oh, the mortgage is, $2,000. I'm gonna rent out each unit for 1,500. It's a 3 unit. I'm gonna live in one, rent out the other two for 1,500 each, and then I'm gonna be making $1,000. I'm gonna be collecting 3,000 in rent. So I actually spent a lot of money on these units. I really cleaned these units up. If you look here, like I really took care of these units. These units, I mean, they weren't in bad shape, but they weren't in the greatest shape. So let's say your mortgage is $2,000, and I'm going to rent out the other 2 units, live in one. I'm going to rent out the other 2 units for 1,500 each. Now, this is just a random example. That's not what was going on here. The rents were much less, and the mortgage was much less. But let's use that as an example. Now, you might be thinking that you're collecting $1,000, even just because your PITI is 2,000 and your rent collected is 3,000. That's so far from the truth. And a lot of people, when they're looking at their first house hack, a lot of times it's their first investment, so they might not have been able to grasp that yet. But it's very important that you understand the difference between what your net is and what your gross profit is. So if your expenses are 3,000, you might be your income is 3,000. That $1,000 is actually going to get chipped away. Even in 1 month, you might put $1,000 in your pocket, but then in 3 months you have a water heater breakdown that you have to replace for $800. In the summer, I always have issues with the AC where I either have to repair them or I have to switch them out. You're not factoring in for that stuff. You don't actually know what your real cash flow is for that property. Okay. So you've got to have a CapEx schedule. Okay. That is a capital expenditure schedule. This is an idea on how much you need to put away every year to address these capital expenditures. So for this property, I was putting away about $200 a year. No, sorry, $200 a month was putting to the side from my income to prepare for CapEx items. This is only because it was a 3 unit and I had done a lot of repairs when I bought it, so I didn't need that much CapEx. But honestly, that was probably low. Probably should have been closer to 300, 400. So I should have been putting that money away because inevitably every summer we had AC issues. Every rainy season we'd have a little bit of a leak, or I got to fix, patch it up, or a toilet leaks, or you got to have those funds and you got to prepare them. You got to figure out how much on average am I going to spend every year doing larger capital expenditure repairs, and how much do I need to put away every month in order to service those, so you have a real idea of cash flow. Actually, towards the end of the property, I actually Airbnb these out for a little bit. I did long term for a while, and then I switched it out to Airbnb. That's why what you're seeing here is the Airbnb photos. Next one is, I made that mistake too, is buying in bad neighborhoods. So this is actually in a pretty bad neighborhood. They finally cleaned it up on the Google Images. This used to all just be trash. This whole alley here was just garbage. It's better now, but it was garbage. There was this house was abandoned, but now they have someone in there now, but it was abandoned. So it looks like it's slowly on the up and coming. This is 2021. So this is about 4 or 5 years ago. So it looks like it is improving slowly, but this is definitely a C minus neighborhood. If I had to put a letter grade on this, I would put a C. And even though that's not the end of the world, and you're usually trading, usually cash flow a little bit better, but you got to keep in mind, number one is you have to live in here. So if you have young kids, I mean, I was 23 when I house hacked, 22 or 23 when I house hacked this. So it really didn't matter to me. I'm a young guy. I know how to protect myself. This isn't a bad environment for me to be in. I didn't feel unsafe personally. But if I had my wife, we weren't married at the time, but even when she would come and stay with me, there was once I got COVID pretty bad when I was living it. So she came over to take care of me and we quarantined together. And, I was nervous about her, out at night. Maybe she was going to go to CVS or something and she would go to the back to go to the car. I keep an eye on her. Those are the kinds of things you got to think about when you're in a C-class neighborhood. If you have kids, I mean, some people want to house hack with kids, and it's a great way to get ahead. House hacking really is, in my opinion, the best way to get into real estate. Get your foot in, save on your costs, and actually start building equity. Is to house hack, but you got to keep in mind what situation you're going to put yourself and your family in. So it really depends on where you are in your life. Now, obviously, I recommend house hacking when you're young and you don't have the responsibility. But if you're watching this and you already have a family, you already have responsibilities, doesn't mean you can't house hack. It just means you got to be aware when you house hack. And I mitigated it as much as I could. Like the way this house was formatted, I really liked. This was like a commercial metal door here that was impossible to open if it was locked. And I made sure this stayed locked all the time, and that only tenants had the key. Combined with that, each unit had its own lock here. I put in a camera up here facing this whole hallway area. I also had a camera out here facing the front. So, I spent some money in order to try to, even though it's a C-class area, I tried to make it a B-class environment for the tenants, and a lot of the tenants really appreciated it. So that was a big plus there. So those are essentially, oh, the last thing is, so because you're living in this property, this is a mistake that I almost made, but luckily I didn't. Because you're living in this property, you get tax benefits if you live in it for over a year. So once you pass 12 months in a primary residence, you get $250,000 tax-free gain. Okay. So for context, I bought this one for, let's look at the actual numbers. I bought this thing for 115, 1217, and then I sold it for 189 in May 23. So obviously we had passed a year from purchase to sale. So my gains here of, what is that, $74,000, 70, 65 grand, let's say, rounded off with expenses and everything. So my 65 grand, I didn't pay a penny of taxes on that money. That money was deposited back to me, and I did not have to pay any taxes on it because I lived in the property. Now, up to 250,000 if you're married, up to $500,000 in gains if you live in the property. Obviously, you want to talk to your CPA about details, but from what I understand, is if you live in a property for over 12 months, you now get tax-free gains up to a certain amount. So I almost sold this property. I actually got an offer to sell this property less than 12 months after I purchased it, and I would have made some decent gains, but they would have been taxed heavily. And I actually made more money by waiting, and I didn't have to worry about taxes. So I actually made a lot more money just by waiting a little bit longer. And another thing is, when you house hack, you only have to live in there for a year. So I didn't live in this thing till the time I sold it. I stayed for the 12 months, and then I left, and then I Airbnb'd the units. So there's a lot of flexibility there, a lot of tax-free opportunity in house hacking. You just got to make sure you don't make these critical mistakes that can really blow up a house hack deal. But it really is the best way to get started. If you're on the fence, you haven't bought your first deal yet, this is the way to get it. Now, obviously, I moved from Southern California to Dayton, Ohio, where I could actually afford a house hack. Not everyone has that flexibility, but even on the higher end, you can still get house hacks. You don't have to zero out your income. Luckily, with this, I was able to not have to pay anything in rent or in mortgage out of pocket because of the way the numbers work. But let's say you're paying, I don't know, $3,000 in rent, and then you can go house hack where the tenants are covering 80% of the mortgage, and you just got to pay $1,000 out of pocket. Like, that's not a failed house hack. You're still you're still saving on your monthly expenses like crazy. So that's still a successful house hack. Okay. And just because you stayed to the end, I'm going to show you, I actually looked up the messages from the tenant that found out I was the owner. And I was kicking him out for several reasons. Like, he stopped, he was paying rent late every single month, always had a different excuse, very loud. He would have these parties in the middle of the night that would just rage on. And I kept telling him to cut it out. And then finally I was like, hey, here's your 30-day notice. You're making it, you're not making it a peaceful place for me to live. The other tenant is also really unhappy with you. I've given you several warnings. You got to leave. And this was, it was in October, so it was cold, but it wasn't freezing, but it was cold. And I wanted him out before the winter came in, but he was pissed. It's like, I don't want to move, nor do I have any money saved to move in the middle of winter. You can't do this bullshit to me. I knew I had a bad feeling about you. You would I mean, I guess when I bought the building, I guess he had a bad feeling about this. I already paid you in advance. So I made him start paying rent in advance because he was paying rent so late, but I refunded him the money, gave him a 30-day notice, and he was out. But then this got worse. I kind of blocked it out because, he started getting vulgar, started getting aggressive. I actually had to leave the apartment and stay with my brother-in-law for 3 or 4 days while this guy, moved his stuff out and, watched the cameras to make sure he indeed moved his stuff out, had to change the lock. So these are the kind of stuff you deal with when they know you're the owner. This goes back to my first point. But go out there, get your first house hack, avoid these mistakes, and it's a great way to get into real estate and make some great money. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I will catch you guys on the next one, and thanks for watching.